to PEG's Fireside Chats with Candidates. I'm Joy Short, and I'm joined today with our co-hosts, Ellen Polivy and David Liston. Our guest this evening is Lucy Lang, who's a candidate for district attorney. Lucy is a nationally recognized criminal justice reform leader. She is a former assistant district attorney in Manhattan who's prosecuted murders, domestic violence, gun crimes, and a whole lot more. She's also served as a professor and the director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution at John Jay College. And she's been a lecturer in law for Columbia School of Law. And she has two absolutely adorable kids. So welcome, Lucy. Thanks for joining us this evening. And I believe that we're going to start with David Liston, who has a question for you.
How would you most distinguish the office under your leadership versus the prior two DAs? What would be most different about the DA's office?
You know, from the first day I launched the campaign, I have had an equal access policy set forth that is long overdue in that office. And it commits to the idea that no matter who someone is or who their attorney may be, there will be no backroom meetings between well-heeled defense attorneys and the district attorney and senior staff. I'm sure you're all aware that there have been a number of high-profile cases in recent years in which connected defense attorneys were given audience with the district attorney. And regardless of what happened in those meetings, which we will never know, there was an ultimate outcome that appeared favorable, and that undermines the public's confidence in the fairness and integrity of the system. So an equal access policy says that whether you have one of New York City's outstanding public defenders representing you, or the fanciest attorney in the world who happened to have gone to law school with the district attorney, you will not be given any special access, and there will be no meetings without the line level prosecutors who handle the case, who know the case best. For many years, if a person was potentially eligible for a non-incarceratory sentence, the way that the decision was made about what kind of sentence they would get was generally done on an ad hoc basis based on negotiations between the lawyers, who of course had no clinical expertise whatsoever and often have limited knowledge of the community-based resources available. I intend to invest significantly in meaningfully scaling those alternatives so that ever more people can be given pro-social supportive services rather than traditional punitive responses.
It's a very crowded field, 8 candidates. How would you most distinguish yourself from the other 7? What makes you so different and so much better equipped?
Well, I think that compared to the mayoral race, it's actually, there's plenty of breathing room in my race. Yeah. But look, I am the candidate who has the depth of experience in Manhattan criminal courts, coupled with the perspective of working very closely alongside progressive district attorneys across the country who are doing the work of operationalizing precisely the reforms that Manhattanites are calling for. I'm so thrilled to have the endorsement of more than a dozen progressive DAs from across the country, and it's based on the work that we have already done together on issues like identifying areas of racial disparity in their offices and creating tailored policies to end them, on work like restorative justice. My campaign is driven by and informed by the people who are most impacted by the system, including victims of sexual violence, families who've lost loved ones to police violence, people who have been through the system themselves and been charged with crimes, and by people who are leading the charge to reform the system across the country. So the depth of my knowledge and the breadth of my experience on prosecution reform specifically distinguishes me tremendously from everyone else in the field.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Lucy.
I have a question for you, David. What's the best piece of advice you got as an assistant DA?
The best piece of advice I got was this. I was getting ready to give my first opening statement, and I was very nervous, and I think maybe anyone would be. And the advice I got was, imagine you're sitting at the table with your family and someone says, tell me about an interesting case you're working on. and then answer the question. In other words, speak to people as if they were your family, your friends, your neighbors. Describe to them in terms that I think everyone can relate to what the case is about, and distill it to the most essential elements. I think that was probably the best advice. I mean, the other piece of advice was do justice, which was not said ironically or tongue in cheek, right? And you heard this too when we were there. We were constantly told, do the right thing. It was never about statistics or politics. Time and time again, I heard that, and I think it was great advice.
Absolutely. Doing justice is really what it's all about. And I like the idea of talking to people as though you're at a dinner table, because it's not what lawyers traditionally do, right? Lawyers speak in legalese, and it's hard to get people out of that. But that goes to what the district attorney can do, which is to bring the community in and to go out into the community and to make people understand that the role of the district attorney is not as a prosecutor alone. Prosecution is just one tool that the district attorney has to deploy, and ideally deploys it as infrequently as possible. But it's incumbent on the district attorney to speak to people in a language they can understand and educate them about what the role entails. And that's been so fascinating to me in this race, how many people really don't have a depth of understanding about what the DA does. And that's something that I'm really committed to working to change and improve.
Well, I hope I get a chance to ask you another question, because I'm going to ask that same question of you, which is, what is the best advice you got? But I don't know whether I'm out of time.
Do it. Ask that question.
Okay, and then I'll pass the candle then.
Yes.
So, Lucy, it was a great question. What was the best advice you got? And you were there many more years than I was.
Gosh, I also received the do justice advice, but the interesting thing is that my understanding of that has changed dramatically over time. But something that I think about a lot, actually, I think I have it right here, is that I was given a copy of, very early on in my tenure, a copy of what's called the dismissal on recommendation, which is the paperwork that the DA filed in dismissing. Actually, this may have been.
Oh, yeah.
The copy of the paperwork the DA filed to dismiss the case against who we now know as the exonerated five. And I have held on to that for all these years. I've given countless copies of it to young lawyers, and I keep it on my desk now because it is a reminder, as the attorney who gave it to me said, of both the worst and the best that a district attorney can do. So I think the best advice you can have is to be mindful of the incredible dangers of the power that come with that sort of position. So
true. So true. Yeah. Okay, I'll hand the candle now, I think, to Ellen, right?
Exactly.
Okay, here.
I also have a candle.
Oh, cool.
Oh, yeah. Great.
All right. Well, so now we're going to the person that knows the least about the district attorney, although I am reading up about it. And unfortunately, I've never been involved with the system, thank goodness. There are an awful lot of people in New York City that have been involved with the system, and the system has caused much damage to public health, to public safety, to the victims. And I have so many questions to ask you. Number one is, how will you keep the community safe while you're decarcerating people? I mean, not that incarceration keeps people safe, but how will you not embolden the perpetrators of crimes by saying, okay, giving them a more lenient sentence? What will you do to help the whole community at large to improve?
I look at problem solving in this context as being a question of looking for long-term solutions. Historically, in the district attorney's office, when a young person is arrested with a gun, the statutory mandatory minimum is 3.5 years in prison, or it can be pled down to 2 years in prison. And I saw time and time again when 18-year-olds would be arrested, sentenced to 2 years in prison, come home and commit a crime very shortly afterwards, or be victimized shortly after returning home from prison. And I saw time and time again that a young person would be prosecuted, get that 2 years for gun possession, and that their brother would then get shot in retaliation for the conflict that had led that person to possess a gun to begin with. this is not problem solving in any meaningful way. So we really need to dramatically rethink the way we deploy resources and recognize that for many folks, carrying a gun, as incredibly dangerous as it is for all of us, that it is a potential for providing someone with supports. And there has been great data showing that when you identify people who are at risk of carrying guns and provide them with educational and job resources, that they are much more likely to succeed than if they are incarcerated for 2 years. So thinking broadly about these problems and not getting swept up in the kind of fear mongering that suggests that bail reform is responsible for the increase in crime as compared to the pandemic that has left 1 million New Yorkers out of work. That is critical to the work of implementing reforms. So one of the strategies that I have set forth from the first day of my campaign is a fast track gun court, because due to the nature of and the length of these sentences, those sorts of cases linger around the courthouse for a year and a half. And right now with COVID court closures, there are 16,000 backlogged cases because of court closures that have to get dealt with by, in all likelihood, the next district attorney. So there's a real need to start to move cases more quickly and fairly through the system. And with respect to gun cases, for example, ensuring that everyone in the courtroom takes a trauma-informed approach that understands the underlying causes that propel especially young people to pick up a gun is the first step in that direction. And then building out supportive services. You know, you think about the fact that on Rikers Island on any given day, there are twice as many staff as there are incarcerated people. It is a remarkable example of bloat and how there are resources available when we think differently about responding to the things we're concerned about as a society. We can direct towards better supporting people and creating long-term change that elevates people across generations.
Right, right. So that brings me to the next question, which is, I'm a social worker. And social workers know that if you help the children and you help the families, then the children will grow up to be more successful adults. But that's a 20-year process. And so there needs to be some sort of metrics on the way, because it's not like a business where, you know, you make a change here and things happen tomorrow. You know, you make a change here and you may see little signs of things happening. Children might be doing better in school, families are eating better, they're not as sick, you know, they're improved health, etc. And I'm wondering if you as a DA have a certain set of metrics that you would be using to check to make sure that your changes, your interventions are changing the trajectory of people's lives into the future.
It really is generational change that we're talking about here. And I think that the whole set of systems that have to bring their resources to bear to solve these problems are going to have to coordinate to address the metrics. But one of my concerns is that traditionally in criminal justice, the metric is recidivism. And so the notion is, well, the system fails if someone gets caught back up in the system again. But it seems clear to me that even if someone gets out of prison and is never arrested again, but has lost contact with their family, is unemployed, and lives out the rest of their days in despair, that is not a successful system. So we need a kind of rubric for measuring people's successful reintegration. And that is also an investment in kids. When you think about the way that we have approached responses to crime over the past generation, that we have not just removed people from their communities, we have severed their ties. We move them far away from their families. We disable families from visiting them. We strip them of the right to vote, which we know is a fundamentally altruistic and connecting behavior. And I just published a piece over the weekend calling for New York to stop the practice of felony disenfranchisement. There are all 48 of the states that prohibit people from voting from prison passed those laws in the wake of Jim Crow as intentional efforts to deprive newly enfranchised Black men of the right to vote. So that is just one of a number of areas where where the way the criminal justice system is currently structured breaks families and causes the kind of generational harm that you're describing. You know, there are 80,000 kids in New York State who have an incarcerated parent. Those kids are amongst the most at-risk kids in our state for criminal justice involvement themselves. Why we are not pouring resources onto those kids is absolutely beyond me, but it does require thinking in the way that you're talking on more of a 20-year timeline. And maybe one of the challenges is that district attorneys, like so many others, are up for re-election every 4 years. And so saying, give me a generation, I'm working on it, is not always the right way to frame it. But I do really believe that we are in a moment where the public's appetite for change is tremendous. And that if there's anything good to be gleaned from George Floyd's murder, it is that all eyes are on the criminal justice system, and that people are willing to see the faults in the system and to call for something dramatically different, which I believe is really what we're on the precipice of. But here in Manhattan, we have to do it in a way that is grounded in data. We have to look to best practices. We have to make sure that while we treat people with dignity and elevate principles of equity, we are not just we're not just guessing, and we're not just sort of washing our hands of things that have traditionally, sadly, fallen to the criminal justice system that belong in public health systems, perhaps, but that require the creation of warm pathways for people to get there.
Right. I've got many more questions, but I'm going to pass the candle to Joyce.
Here I am. Okay. Yeah, I'm curious about something that that I see in the repeal of cash bail, and that is, you know, how do we expect to get people back to trial when there's no cash bail that you know, makes it makes it difficult for them to skip out?
Yeah, actually, the data is pretty good in states that have done away with cash bail, that people tend to return to court when they're given adequate other support. So one of the problems with the statute in New York is that it was totally unfunded. So there is not a comprehensive system of supervised release to help remind people when they have to come back to court. I mean, even something as simple as text message reminders have been shown to drastically increase people's likelihood of complying with the terms of their release. Mm-hmm. So before the pandemic started, after the bail reform went into effect, those were happening sort of at a small level. But the reality is that right now the courts are closed for the most part, and we're talking about a lot of remote functioning. So it's hard to measure people's returning to court right now, since trials aren't happening anyway. But when you look to New Jersey, which abolished cash bail a number of years ago, they did not have a significant increase in failures to appear.
That's very interesting. Yeah. And also, can you explain restorative justice from your perspective and how you would go about implementing that concept in the district attorney's office?
Some of you may know that restorative justice refers to a large category of practices that are rooted in the practices of indigenous peoples, including things like peacemaking circles, where a person who has experienced harm is brought together with a person who harmed them, and they, after agreeing separately to meet, and often with other community members present, they explore the harm that was caused. Sometimes it results in an apology, sometimes it doesn't. And I make have no pretense that this is a panacea or that it should be used in all kinds of crime. In particular, I have a lot of concerns about suggesting that it should be used in instances of sexual violence or domestic violence, or cases where there is a very clear abuse of power dynamic that can be reified sometimes by that kind of experience. It should be an absolutely voluntary undertaking. But I did have the incredibly unique opportunity to witness it work in a truly remarkable way maybe 2 years ago, there was a case in which a beloved professor from Lehman College was taking money out of an ATM machine on Broadway and 86th Street. And a man who had fallen on hard times was waiting outside the ATM. And when the professor came out with his money, the man who was waiting stole the money, pushed the professor, and the professor fell, hit his head, and died of his injuries. So the man was charged with felony murder and was facing 20 to life. But the assistant district attorney who had taken my college and prison class that I mentioned, she had read about restorative justice and about its use, especially in the EU, in serious cases. And the family of the professor who'd been killed were very concerned about justice reform issues. And they kept asking her about what's happening to the man who committed the crime in prison and what's going to happen to him when he goes upstate. And so she broached the idea of restorative justice and ultimately hired a trained facilitator. And I had the incredible privilege of watching through a one-way mirror, with their consent, of course, while the families, including the man who committed the crime and his sister, and the son of the professor and the son's wife, sat together for several hours, and they just talked. They talked about the book that the professor would never now be able to write. The man who committed the crime talked about what led him to the point of desperation that he made that fateful decision. And at the conclusion of it, they all embraced. And I have seen the conclusion of a lot of homicide trials over time. And I will tell you that I have never seen people leave a criminal justice process with such a measure of peace. So there's tremendous possibility and potential for restorative justice to change the way we think about responding to all manner of crime. But it has to be done thoughtfully, and it has to be done with the absolute agreement and open-hearted willingness of everyone involved.
Excellent. Seems like a wonderful system to implement if we can. David, you're next.
Okay. Two topics that unfortunately, sadly, are very much a part of life today are police brutality and hate crimes. Under your leadership, what will your office do to combat hate crimes as well as police brutality?
I'm so honored to have spent the past few years working to create a set of protocols for how prosecutors can ensure accountability in instances of police violence. And that was built alongside families who lost loved ones to police violence, police chiefs, and assistant district attorneys in my role at the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution, and very much informed the plan I've laid out on my website for police accountability. And I'm really grateful to have the endorsement of a number of those families, including Sean Bell's mother and others. And part of what they taught me is that it is not just a question of full investigation and prosecution when someone dies at the hands of police, but really of how the police are engaged in the community well before that kind of tragedy occurs. You know, I think of my friend Valerie Castile, whose son Philando Castile was killed by police a number of years ago. And Philando had been stopped in his car by police 50 times before he was ultimately shot. And it's really an incredible example of how we just need to minimize the amount of contact the police have, in particular with communities of color. And if police are not stopping people for smoking marijuana and not chasing them for rolling dice, it minimizes the likelihood that something tragic happens. So there's a tremendous amount of room for kind of front end policy change, as well as making sure that there's appropriate accountability. And I have set forth, made a commitment to fully funding full-time attorneys to staff an official misconduct unit that will investigate police officers charged with misconduct and track police officers who are found not to be credible on the witness stand, or where there are any other allegations of anything that undermines the integrity of their badge. Oh, and hate crimes. I have also had the remarkable experience, and especially in the early months of my campaign, to work with members of interfaith groups and of Asian American community groups to build a plan for better responding to hate crimes. It's an area now at the district attorney's office in which people are staffed kind of part-time, and it really does require a full-time comprehensive response, especially given the really catastrophic numbers that we have seen in the past couple of months. But it's not, again, not just a question of making sure there's accountability when these instances occur. Part of it is a reporting problem, that so many communities who are victimized by hate crime are vulnerable communities who may have language barriers, may have skepticism of law enforcement, sometimes well-founded, may not be able to take the time off of work to be able to come and report something, may be concerned about immigration consequences. There are so many barriers to reporting. And it's really incumbent on the district attorney to create mechanisms for people to report. So I'm committed to doing intake at the DA's office in Harlem and the Washington Heights office, to making sure that everything's available in multiple languages, to creating an anonymous hotline for reporting if people are concerned. And of course, I've been an outspoken advocate for our non-citizen communities and making sure that people who are concerned about their status are able to stay here with U visas, T visas, and will not be victimized by ICE in our courthouses.
I just want to point out for the record that you got to be careful with your candle. My notes just went up in flames.
Oh no.
I don't know if you can see that.
It's truly a fireside chat.
Please,
Definitely.
I want to add, that's right. Let's keep the fire in the fireplace.
Roosevelt Island. Good. Ellen, how about you?
Okay.
Well, Dave's putting out his flames here.
That's right.
Putting out the flames.
I was listening. I was so wrapped by your answer, by the way, I didn't notice that my papers were on fire. So it's a compliment to you, Lucy.
Thank you.
Okay, so Lucy, you really gave us one, or actually, we asked you for all 4 of your plans, and I think you gave us 2. Are there 2 other ones that you?
Oh, well, I have 27 plans set forth on the website, but I put them in 4 different categories.
Categories, yes. So one was accountability. One was community safety, which you touched upon. One was reducing incarceration. What was the other one?
And restoring community. And this is really such an important piece. I'm sure David will remember the community outreach efforts that have long been a part of that office, and probably also be able to envision an office that really invested more significantly in community outreach, especially at a time like this when there is so much distrust of law enforcement and so much urgency around change. I am committed to working closely with community groups to educate people about the DA's office and to be more transparent. So that includes things like publishing case level data so that people can search data demographically, anonymized of course, to make sure that there aren't racial disparities at different levels of the process. It includes scaling the college and prison program that I created that brings ADAs inside prisons, because that really is the way to get closest to the consequences of your decision-making day to day as an assistant DA, is to go week after week into a prison and to study and work alongside incarcerated New Yorkers. So restoring community is in so many ways at the core of what the next district attorney has to be able to do, and is a fundamental tenet of my candidacy.
You know, while you're speaking about community, we have some things on Roosevelt Island that make us kind of unique. One of them is that we're actually policed by the state of New York and not by NYPD. The end result is that we don't have a civilian complaint review board out here. In fact, David had served on the civilian complaint review board at one time. But I'm wondering if there's anything that you as a district attorney can do in order to create some oversight in our dealings with the public safety department, because they're not really under the watchful eye of anybody other than REOC that they actually work for. And so that's sort of like the fox guarding the hen house. Not that I consider the public safety department to be guilty of major wrongdoing. But it's certainly best for the community to have some type of oversight over what's going on in the public safety department. For example, we had an issue, and we're continuing to have that issue with the public lewdness. And a couple of years ago, they overlooked about 5 cases of public lewdness. And just this past summer, there was a homeless man who was actually hanging out in some of our parks and exposing himself in front of children in the parks. And rather than arresting him, the public safety department put it down as aided, in other words, a person in need of assistance, and did not arrest him. And, considering the fact that this is something that does affect children, it would seem to be an issue that really should be addressed in a more serious fashion. So is there something that you can envision that would enable us to have a better oversight with our public safety officers here on Roosevelt Island?
That's something I would really look to you to partner on, because I simply don't know enough about the structure or challenges of the relationship between that department and your specific community to be able to make any prescriptions now. But I think that what you're pointing to is such a critically important point, which is a need for oversight and for process. And if you have a sense that there are recurring needs in your community that are going unmet by your local law enforcement, then that's an area where the district attorney can potentially help, if only to help facilitate getting everyone at the table and surfacing what these challenges are. So I would be, I think, remiss if I offered specific prescriptions without learning more. But I assure you, Joyce, that when elected district attorney, we will sit down with your public safety department and address these issues and figure out the best way to collaboratively take them on together, because it is, in a sense, it's interesting because it's like it's a microcosm of what's happening in so many places across the country, where you're calling for help of a certain kind, and it sounds like not getting perhaps efforts at reform have undermined your the ability or the willingness of law enforcement to respond in the way that the community is asking for. So it certainly requires thought and investment, and I would be happy to work with you on it.
Fabulous. So folks, how about one more question from each? And if anybody has a question that they'd like to put in the chat, we're happy to address that and have Lucy answer it. So before we leave, you can just write your questions right in the chat, and we'll read them and get an answer from Lucy. So Ellen, you're up first. One more.
So do you have a pot of money in the DA's office that you could use to fund programs in the community? And if so, how would you use that money?
The short answer to that question, and I might be the only candidate or one of the few candidates who's going to give you the honest answer, is no. That the asset forfeiture money that people associate with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office that came as a result of major bank sanctions cases over the course of the past decade or so will be virtually entirely spent by the time the next district attorney takes office. And the law has changed so that any funds seized in comparable fashion will go to the city or the state rather than be at the district attorney's discretion. So there will not be the kind of multi-million-dollar investments in community-based organizations that you saw during the Vance administration, from no matter who is the next district attorney. That said, there are really important ways in which the budget can be shrunken and reallocated to community-based groups. And that is something that I'm very committed to doing, especially with respect to handling crimes, handling instances like substance misuse and mental health challenges, where we spend a tremendous amount of resources cycling those folks through the court system, having ADAs assigned to the cases, when in reality, so many folks really need to be seen by a social worker and be given a pathway to supportive housing. So that's an area where the district attorney can make a huge public safety investment by not deploying the tool of prosecution, even though the district attorney has that tool. Because the district attorney has these other tools as well, but we need to go to social workers and folks who have expertise in addressing those sorts of issues in order to be able to deploy them appropriately.
Thank you.
Dave, one more.
Lucy, when I was at the DA's office 100 years ago, I remember some very late nights on the eve of trial, myself standing in front of a copy machine, frantically copying piles and piles of documents that I was required to turn over to the defendant the next day on the eve of trial. And at the time, it felt like a tremendous burden. And yet, I also sometimes thought the defendant has had a case against him or her for a year or two, and now only on the eve of trial does the law require the DA to turn over those materials. As you know, since then, the pendulum arguably may have gone the other way. Now, almost immediately upon the defendant's arrest, there is a long list of materials and information that the DA must share with the defendant almost immediately. And some people say that's good, that's as it should be, that the defendant should be able to see the information from the beginning. Other people have raised concerns about everything from safety of crime victims whose names and contact information might be shared with the defendant. And some people say that it's just too much information given too quickly for not enough of a good reason to the defense. What are your thoughts about these changes with regard to the sharing of information with the defense?
I'm in favor of early and open discovery. I don't believe that anyone should be playing hide the ball in criminal cases, and that it is incumbent on prosecutors to gather everything they are able and to provide it to defense such that an appropriate decision can be made about how the case is going to be resolved. That said, I have handled many cases in which there was serious risk to witnesses, and am very committed to the use of protective orders for making sure that the personal identifying information of witnesses is protected. And in fact, I handled a case that still haunts me, where a young woman was shot 12 times in the back in the lobby of her own apartment building because she was believed to be cooperating with a federal investigation, which turned out to be entirely untrue. But of course, it was too late for her. But devastatingly, we were never able to prosecute the person responsible for her killing because people were so terrified, given what he had done, believing her to have been cooperating. I actually just spoke to her family a couple of weeks ago and learned that the man who committed the crime recently passed away. And so it took that for them to feel any kind of resolution on this case. So the risk to witnesses weighs heavy on me and will be something that assistant district attorneys under my administration take extremely seriously. But I am also committed to making sure that people are given all of the evidence necessary to be able to make an appropriate assessment about their case. And right now, as you may know, Dave, we're talking about voluminous evidence. We are talking about body-worn cameras, about precinct surveillance, about text messages and emails between officers. We're talking about massive amounts of street surveillance, social media evidence. I mean, there's huge amounts to be gathered and sorted through. And that goes to why the next district attorney also has to have a really deep understanding of the operations of that office, which is a 500 lawyer nearly office with with something like 800 non-legal staff and a whole complex set of operational concerns that need to be upgraded, updated and that need to be reform oriented so that we can take advantage of technical fixes to make sure that materials get directly uploaded from the police department, appropriately redacted, that protective orders are issued, and that folks get the information they're entitled to in a timely fashion so that cases can be appropriately resolved.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Anybody else have anything that they want to put in the chat? Nothing yet. Okay, folks. So I think we're kind of exhausted our time. So thank you so much for joining us, Lucy, and illuminating us with your wonderful platform. And we wish you the best of luck. It was lovely having you here this evening.
Thank you so much. It's my great pleasure. And I will count on us doing it in person on Roosevelt Island sometime when we are able. I would be thrilled to have all of your support in my candidacy. I mentioned some of the remarkable people who have supported me so far, who have included survivors of sexual abuse by Harvey Weinstein, families who lost loved ones to police violence, and progressive prosecutors from across the country. My campaign is really driven by the people who know the system best as victims and as people who have gone through the system, and by the folks who are leading the charge to reform it. You can learn more about me at votelucylang.com and follow me on social media at LucyLangNYC. I look forward to staying in touch with all of you and wish you all a safe and healthy night. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And I want to remind everybody that the date for the primary and for the district attorney race is June 22nd, and your vote is your voice. So make sure that we hear it loud and clear on June 22nd.
Well, make sure everybody knows that it's one vote.
It's one vote. Yeah, the district attorney vote is a state vote, and it's not a ranked voting system. You only get one person that you can vote for. You can't vote for your first choice, your second choice, your third choice. You have to vote for the one and only person that you actually want to be the next district attorney. So thanks for that reminder, Ellen. Okay, folks, have a good evening, and we'll see you next time.